Excellent. Good morning, Gilbert. How are you doing today, sir?
Hey, how you doing?
Absolutely fantastic. I got to ask you a question right off the bat, only because North Carolina has a Polk County. This is not in North Carolina, is it?
No, this is the Florida Polk County. Polk County, they call it in Florida, they call it Imperial Polk County, which is interesting because some people think it was because they had so many imperial wizards from the clan living there, but turns out it's not. It's more just because they had a lot of paved roads.
To share this story, I mean, my God, there are so many twists and turns, and we're going this way, we're going that way. I mean, how are you keeping it together as a podcaster?
It's interesting. You started this investigation, and I didn't really know where it was going to go. I mean, I was just sort of looking into this Leo Schofield case and see if it was a wrongful conviction. But then this whole world opened up to me, like the suspect whose fingerprints were found in the car where Michelle was last seen. 17 years later, they're identified, and they come back to this man named Jeremy Scott, who's a convicted murderer, and he lived about a mile away from Leo and Michelle. And so that whole investigation was one the state didn't really do. And so we went back and did it, met all his friends, his family, and we were starting to learn things about Jeremy Scott that, pretty much convinced us that this is the real killer.
One of the things that you do is you piece this together in such an incredible way. I mean, episode number one, I mean, God help us. I mean, a Florida judge reaches out to you. I mean, a judge reached out to you.
Yeah, I mean, that was shocking. I'd never, had that happen. I was signing books and doing a book talk, and this judge came up to me with a business card, and on the back it said, Leo Schofield, not just wrongfully convicted, he's an innocent man. And I remember thinking, judges are not supposed to be commenting about, pending cases. He could lose everything, but he was just told us, like, if I don't do this, who's going to do it? I know this guy is innocent. And he went on to describe how Leo Schofield was railroaded, and everything he was telling me was checking out. So I decided to go down to Florida myself and look into the case.
What was that process like? Because, I mean, you can't just show up knocking on somebody's door. I mean, there's got to be a connection that leads to a connection. I mean, because, I mean, that's the kind of investigative reporter you are.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a lot of connections in Florida because I've spent about the last 20 years of my life just working down there on different stories. And so it was interesting to me, like once this judge gave me this card, I started filing records requests, started talking to people in the area. And as I was learning, like more and more people were saying, oh, that guy, he was totally innocent. That's just a bad case. And the people who were telling me this were people in the legal system. And it was just kind of shocking to me. So I decided to just do a deep investigation. And, it took 4 years of my life. I mean, it's not something I do really fast. That's part of the problem, I think, is that I can take my time and really get to know people and get their trust, and they started talking to me. And by the end, almost everybody I wanted to agreed to talk to me except for the prosecutors.
I'm so glad that you admitted that it took 4 years of your life, because so many people that I want to do a podcast, I want to jump into it, let's go bang out a podcast. No, the professionals are taking their time. How were you able to hold back and not relinquish it so quickly?
Well, I think I approached it the same way I work on my books. I thought in the beginning, I don't know how long this is going to take. I thought maybe I'll do a feature story or something like that. But what ended up happening, I was meeting so many people, and they were talking to me, and they were great storytellers, and they were really powerful personalities. And I remember thinking, like, this should be on tape. I really should record this. And then sort of had the idea, like, why can't I do a podcast? Everybody's alive. I'm used to dealing with, dead people from documents from 60, 70 years ago. Now everyone was talking to me, including, Leo Schofield in prison, and ultimately Jeremy Scott himself. And so, now that I have this tape, I just thought, well, I want to take my time and do the investigation the way I would do a book, and just do it thorough. And so I want to make sure that I have the whole story and I'm not just forcing something out there. And so just being careful about it and wanting to tell the story right.
Well, and you do it at such an incredible pace, because even when you jump into trial by ambush, I mean, we're right there with the case being built. We have witnesses that say, something happened when Michelle disappeared.
Right. And, this is one of the things that was really interesting to me, is that this is all based on one witness who lived across the street from Leo. And she claimed that on the night that Michelle disappeared, she saw Leo carrying something heavy out of the trailer and putting it into the back of this Mazda. And so that made this trailer the scene of the crime. But, remarkably, police were never able to find one single drop of blood in this trailer where Michelle was supposedly stabbed 26 times. And Leo had an alibi, like, just throughout the night. He was seen in the same clothes, and there was never any blood on his clothes. So that just really was a giant red flag to me. And it felt like they were forcing this trailer to be the crime scene when it really wasn't.
You know what's really interesting about this, because I love a great mystery. I love crime stories and stuff like that. I used to joke around about put the author of the book on trial, because I want to hear their side of the story. They know. It's beginning to be the same thing with podcasters, Gilbert, that it's like, put you guys up there on that stand. Tell us what you know.
Well, exactly. And I think in this particular case, and I see this a lot, the state just sort of rushed through their investigation. They were trying to protect the conviction of Leo Schofield. So they didn't really want to investigate Jeremy Scott, because that could overturn their whole case against Leo Schofield. And so they did a really, I think, not just a sloppy job. I just think they didn't want to know the answer. And so we set out to do the investigation that the state never did. We tracked down all his old friends, his old girlfriend, all of these people that were connected to Jeremy. And the picture that we are able to paint was an extraordinarily violent person who completely contrasts with Leo Schofield, who's just this, hard rock guitarist. Mm-hmm. Jeremy's an extraordinarily violent guy who's, committing all sorts of murders in that same area. It just seems like a no-brainer.
So is Leo still behind bars?
He is. He's been in prison now for 35 years. He's exhausted all his appeals. And here's the horrible thing, Arrow, is that he's a model inmate. He's just a dream inmate. He never commits any infractions whatsoever. He's a leader in the prison. And every time he comes up for parole, because he served his minimum of 25 years, he's denied. And the reason he's denied is because the state attorney shows up and says, Leo Schofield has never said he's sorry. He's never shown any remorse for this crime. And they won't let him out of prison because of that. And this man who claims he's innocent, he's not going to admit to something he didn't do. And that's what's keeping him in prison now.
And yet they found Jeremy Scott's fingerprints. I mean, that's the part that gets me.
Right. Not only that, but Jeremy eventually confessed to the crime itself. Yeah. I mean, so, here you have a man who's forensically tied to the crime scene who has confessed, and yet the state is still, arguing that it's just a coincidence that this murderer happened to steal a stereo out of a car of a murder victim.
How do you put the podcast together? I just envision you being in this conference room, and you've got on this gigantic board with a bunch of pictures and a bunch of yarn connecting everything together.
That's sort of like my office, but it's funny. But what happens is when you do a podcast, and we really started, during COVID, there's no board where nobody wants to be in the same room together. So basically, I was in my daughter's closet, putting up foam and the microphone, and sort of making my at-home studio right there, which it seemed to work pretty well. But it's not as glamorous as people think.
Yeah, but don't you love the idea though that with the podcast, podcasts don't come with rules anymore. All it's about is content and connection. And when I'm sitting in the front seat of the car and I'm listening to Bone Valley, I feel like you are talking to me. You are sharing the story with me.
There's something really extraordinarily intimate about it. And I didn't really realize it because I'd never done it before. But I remember just sitting in a car once interviewing somebody because I didn't have a studio. So I just pulled into a parking lot and interviewing this woman in Central Florida. And it's actually the perfect studio. Turned off the air conditioning, sitting in a car. And I went back and listened to it. I'm like, wow, it seems like she's sitting right next to me talking, and you can hear voices crack when you get to really emotional interviews. And I think, eventually you can tell when people are telling the truth and dealing with memory and when people are lying. And there's a certain intimacy that you get with a microphone in front of you and hearing it on headphones or in a car.
Dude, I interviewed Yoko Ono in the front seat of my car because I felt like it was probably the most quietest place I could find.
That's so great. That's amazing.
So when with everything that you've done in the investigation and building the story and having the podcast Envision, when you come across a part that a juror doesn't think that Leo is guilty, all of a sudden, I mean, your imagination has got to be going, oh man, we're onto something here.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Like, this is Florida. So it's a crime that took place, 37 years ago, I guess. So we went to track down the jurors. Most of them were retired at the time of the trial. So they're all dead. But we did find this one 22-year-old juror who really said she was too young to be on this trial because it was such a gruesome murder. But, we interviewed her. My research assistant, Kelsey Decker, went out and tracked her down and interviewed her. And, I was shocked by what she said. She goes, I didn't think he was guilty, but, she felt like that she was dealing with the adults in the room and they wanted to convict. So she went along with it. But here's the remarkable thing, Arrow. She kind of regretted that. So when they came to the sentencing part, she kind of held firm and said, I don't believe in the death penalty. And she said that the other jurors felt sorry for her and decided to switch their sentence from the electric chair to life in prison. So this juror who didn't believe Leo was guilty, she might have been the person who saved Leo's life. She was a holdout juror, and she convinced the others to come on board.
Does that inspire you to want to go look into other juries and stuff like that, just to find out what they're doing and how people are coerced into doing different things? It's almost like
absolutely.
it's a bully pin is what it is.
Yeah, it is. And, it's funny. I was talking to a friend who, works in the state prosecutor's office, and she was listening to it. And she said, that's the thing we always sort of assumed was happening, but we never heard a juror say it out loud, that they thought someone was innocent, but they went along with the rest of them because they felt pressure. It's just so tragic when you hear that, because all it takes is one juror to stand up to that and cause a mistrial. But on the other hand, the fact that Leo was convicted and could have went to the electric chair, she probably saved his life. So it's just a fascinating story.
Okay, so the body is found. There's 26 stab wounds. My God, that's crazy. That's an insane mind right there.
Right. And, it's like these sort of mythological remembrances of evidence where the prosecutors say, well, someone who stabbed multiple times like that, that's a crime of passion. It has to be somebody who knows. And, there's no scientific study that says that. There's plenty of strangers who kill other strangers violently. So, but there's this mythological thing that sort of has an impact on the jury. Like, oh, yes, that's a crime of passion. It could only be the husband. And I think the way they sort of tied it together, saying, well, she still had her wedding rings on. So obviously it couldn't have been a stranger, because only if it was a robbery, they would have taken those wedding rings. Well, you can't really look into the head of a criminal, especially somebody like Jeremy Scott, who's killed multiple people in multiple different ways. He's forensically tied to those murders, and he's confessed to them. So, here you have proof that this person is not a crime of passion. He's killing strangers.
Yeah. Have you had the opportunity to talk with Leo, or are we going to find out in future episodes? Because there are 9 altogether.
Yeah, Leo I've talked to multiple times. I think 7 or 8 times. I constantly email him, but Jeremy Scott was the one that we weren't sure we were able to get. He'd never really talked to anybody about it before. I started writing to him during COVID, and about 7 months later, he wrote back to me and said, yeah, I've always wanted to tell my story, but I don't know how to do it. And so we arranged a visit for him, and we interviewed him in the 9th episode, the final episode. And, I think it's going to be a pretty powerful episode for people.
To go there, my God, your heart must have been, pounding hard or pounding very, very slowly.
You're absolutely right. Every time he'd been interviewed by like investigators and detectives, he's always like shackled, handcuffed, legs and feet. Guards are standing by. And in this particular case, I go in there with Kelsey, my research assistant, and it's just us in a room with him, no guards, no handcuffs. So it was kind of terrifying to begin with, but, he was just very relaxed, and we got the sense that he was just there to talk. And so we didn't have any problems with him, but it was definitely nerve-wracking to start.
Did you feel like you at any time that you were the psychologist, that you were the one that was, your calling on that particular day was to be the listener?
Yeah, that's really a really great question, because I think he'd always been interrogated by police and lawyers who were trying to get a story out of him. And he's always in hostile conditions and doesn't want to be there. And with us, we just said, like, do you want to tell our story? We're here to hear your story. And so we sort of approached it in a way like a therapist would, like, how did that make you feel? And we could tell very quickly on he was dealing with memory.
Yep.
He wasn't lying to us. I think in the past he'd lied to prosecutors, but he couldn't keep his story straight. In this one, he was dealing with memory, and it's really emotional. And it was just, I think it was just very obvious to me that he just was being haunted by his past.
One of the things that I took note of on being on iHeartRadio is that you actually have transcripts and stuff like that from Duncan Grady. I mean, in the way that, I've never seen anybody put that, as an attachment onto their podcast.
Yeah, it's just something that he's a very colorful figure. He's the sheriff in Polk County. He's been on the force since he was 17 years old. And, we asked him to put on his historian's hat and just talk about what it was like trying to solve murders back in the 1980s. And, he was just very honest. He said, it was very difficult for us to solve murders back then because they were coming one after another. And we didn't have cell phone cameras. We didn't have cameras and we didn't have DNA evidence. If you didn't solve something right away, it was impossible. And he sort of walked us through that whole process.
So now what happens after episode 9? You're not going to sit around. You're enjoying this way too much. Have you already invested in another podcast of any sort?
No, I really haven't. I
Really?
have to start thinking about this. Yeah, I have some ideas for a book that I was supposed to be writing, and I sort of took a break from it And I sort of attribute that to Kelsey because I was, working on this book, and she said, we can't work on a book. There's a guy in prison. And I said, yeah, you're right. This is sort of more urgent. Let's do that one. And so I put my book on hold and started working on the Leo case. And I'm really so glad I did. It's been an honor to actually tell this story.
Are there any groups that are coming together to try to free Leo? I mean, once this podcast gets around the world and stuff like that, well, are you expecting people to gather?
I expect that they will. I think when people listen to this whole series, they're going to be absolutely outraged the fact that Leo Schofield is still in prison. And, the Innocence Project is now representing Leo. I think he's got a great legal team behind him, but he's sort of out of options legally. And so that's the importance of storytelling. I think we change the narrative. I think that the narrative that we present in Bone Valley, I'll put that against the state's narrative anytime, and I'll leave it to the people to decide which version is the truth.
Oh, my God. This is such an incredible thing. I mean, because, people do listen to podcasts because of the crime series and stuff like that, but this is authenticity, and that's what listeners need to understand, that this is not somebody sitting down and writing a story, that this is the physical, actual events.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think one of the things that, not able to do with the book, I think this story has a lot of heart because we're living this for 4 months. We're around Leo's family. We're going to, hearings together, and we're sort of embedded with the defense. And then we become embedded with Jeremy's side of the story. So, everybody was talking to us and telling us stories. And this is all stuff that the state never even bothered to look into. And so I think, we end up coming up with a narrative that, to me, is so much more believable than the narrative that the state presented to convict Leo.
You're a man that writes books. That's such a personal thing. It's one-on-one between you and the computer screen or you and the page. When you do a podcast, now you've got a team. Oh God, dude. Now you've got to involve other people.
And I tell you, it's one of the greatest experiences of my life. I had like these young women who just know storytelling, and I could bring what I knew from writing books, but they could help me shape it into some kind of narrative that works, with sound. And I just think it was such a pleasure to collaborate with people that were totally into the story. We were all on the same page, and it sort of drove us to work even harder to tell this story. So actually, the experience makes me want to go do another one right away.
Speaking of the experience, how do you keep it under 60 minutes where Joe Rogan, the experience, can't keep it under 2 hours?
It was hard. I'm telling you, we honestly felt we had 2 podcasts here to knock it down to 9 episodes. Oh yeah, we did so much work on this. I think, we probably ended up using 25% of what we got. It was heartbreaking to see some of the stuff that we cut. Just because there were so many interesting people, it was just impossible to keep everybody in the story. We had to really tighten it up. So yeah, it was very difficult. And even over 9 hours, which is really the length of like an audiobook, we have so much more that we could have used. It's really staggering, actually.
Do you find yourself going maybe to Netflix or to Hulu to take what you've done with this story to extend it?
Well, yeah, there's definitely been some interest in that, and we're having conversations like that right now. But it has to be done a certain way, I believe, and I just, I'm a firm believer in that, in the power of storytelling, and I just, I didn't want it to be sensationalized. I wanted it to be serious, and I wanted to make sure that there was just complete integrity and compassion and heart, and I honestly think that's what we have: a real story with heart and emotion.
All right, from one podcaster to another podcaster, we know what those sound bites are. To us, we hear something, we think it's valuable. I mean, how do you deal with taking those sound bites and then creating the story? Because someone's got to go in there and they've got to edit it, and the editor is usually the bad guy.
Yeah, and I tell you, in this particular case, the editors were pulling things that I'd totally forgotten that people had said, and I just like, wow, I didn't even understand that when he said it. A lot of times, Leo will say things and they just don't register because you're thinking of the next question, or you're not really focusing on his words so much. And I go back and hear it later. I'm like, did he just say what I think he just said? It was so brilliant. And that was happening constantly in a lot of the interviews, especially with Leo. He's just such a well-spoken and transparent guy. He always surprised us.
Oh my God, you just took me back, Gilbert, because I've had television producers scream in my IFB going, you didn't listen to what he just said. Your next question was right there.
Yeah, and that was really why Kelsey was there, especially when we went in with Jeremy Scott. We were working off each other. We'd done a lot of preparation for this, but we were able to go back and forth with our questions. And she was just so great about just going in and saying, how did that make you feel at certain times, and really drawing out some of his best answers.
Oh my God. Gilbert, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you, sir.
Anytime, Al. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay, sir?
You, sir. You too.